The afternoon sun burned hot against the cracked pavement as Sergeant David Carter adjusted his worn-out military cap, his gaze fixed ahead. The world had changed since he last stepped foot in this city, his city, but some things, he figured, stayed the same. He had served his country, risked his life, and came home expecting peace. Instead, he found himself face to face with a harsh reality. Officer Mark Reynolds tightened his grip on his baton, watching David approach. To him, it was just another day, another routine patrol, another moment where he felt the need to assert his authority. But today was different. Today, his actions would have consequences he never saw coming. Just down the street, in a crowded city bus, a teenager named Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the long school day pressing against his shoulders. He was young, bright, and always taught to do the right thing. So when he saw the pregnant woman step onto the bus, her tired eyes scanning the full seats, he didn't hesitate. He stood up, motioning for her to take his place. The woman, Sarah, smiled, a small, grateful smile that carried something deeper. She reached into her purse, pulling out a folded note. As she handed it to him, her hands trembled slightly, as if the words inside carried a weight she had held for too long. Jamal hesitated, his fingers tightening around the paper. What could it possibly say? Outside, David stood tall, refusing to be disrespected. But Officer Reynolds saw it differently. He saw defiance. He saw a man who needed to be put in his place. The moment his boot lifted off the ground, aimed at David's chest, he didn't realize he was making the biggest mistake of his career. And just as Jamal unfolded the note, his eyes widening at the words before him, the sound of a scuffle outside made heads turn. The past and present were colliding in ways no one could predict. But what did the note say? And would David let this injustice go unanswered? Everything was about to change. Jamal's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the note. The corners of the paper were creased, the ink slightly smudged as if it had been written in a hurry. His heart pounded in his chest. He had expected a simple thank you, or maybe a kind word, but as his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. The bus rocked slightly as it came to a stop, the chatter of passengers fading into a dull hum in the background. Jamal's fingers tightened around the note as he reread the words, trying to make sense of them. Why would she write this? What did it mean? He glanced up at the woman, but she was staring straight ahead, her hands resting on her belly as if protecting the life growing inside her. There was something in her expression, a quiet sadness, or maybe hesitation, like she wanted to say something more but couldn't bring herself to. Before he could ask, the bus doors hissed open, and she stood up, moving carefully toward the exit. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for just a moment, and then she was gone, disappearing into the busy sidewalk. Jamal sat frozen, gripping the note, his mind racing. He had to find out more. Meanwhile, outside on the street, David stumbled back slightly as the officer's boot connected with his side. A sharp pain shot through his ribs, but his instincts kicked in before he could fully process it. Years of training, discipline, and survival rushed through him in an instant. He steadied himself, locking eyes with Officer Reynolds, who was already reaching for his radio. David could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had been through worse, far worse. He had stood in battlefields, faced enemies who saw him as nothing more than a target. But never had he expected to come home and be treated as if he didn't belong, as if his service meant nothing. The crowd that had been watching murmured among themselves, a few people pulling out their phones. A woman gasped. A man took a cautious step forward but hesitated, unsure of whether to intervene. This wasn't just another street altercation. This was something bigger. And David knew it. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, his fists tightening at his sides. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not here. Not today. Back on the bus, Jamal finally snapped out of his thoughts, shoving the note into his pocket as he pressed the button for the next stop. He needed answers. Something inside him told him that this was important, that whatever the note said, it wasn't just random words on a piece of paper. There was something behind it, a story waiting to be uncovered. As he stepped off the bus, his eyes scanned the street, searching for the woman. She was a few feet ahead, walking at a steady pace. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and quickened his steps to catch up. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice uncertain but firm. The woman turned, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, they just stood there, the noise of the city buzzing around them. And then Jamal held up the note. "What does this mean?" he asked. "Why did you give this to me?" The woman looked at the paper in his hand, then up at his face. She hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because you remind me of someone I lost." Jamal's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, but it wasn't that. "Who?" he asked. The woman swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "My brother." Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud commotion down the street caught both of their attention. A small crowd had gathered, voices rising in concern. Then, a sharp, commanding voice rang out over the chaos. "Stay back. Step away." Jamal turned his head toward the sound. He couldn't see much past the gathering of people, but he could feel the tension in the air. He glanced at the woman, who looked just as uneasy as he felt. Something was happening, and he had a feeling it wasn't good. David stood his ground, his muscles tensed as Officer Reynolds reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back," the officer ordered, his tone sharp. David didn't move. "For what?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with restrained anger. "For standing here? For walking down the street?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Obstruction. Resisting. Take your pick." David let out a slow breath. He had been trained to assess situations, to know when to engage and when to stand down. But this wasn't a battlefield, and yet it felt like one. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the cameras recording, the people waiting to see what he would do. Then he made his decision. With deliberate slowness, he raised his hands. Not in surrender, but in control. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm. "Think about what you're doing." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Officer Reynolds' eyes. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The crowd murmured louder now. More phones were lifted, more people stepping closer, no longer just watching but witnessing. And somewhere in that crowd, Jamal and the woman stood, their own story momentarily forgotten as they watched history unfold before their eyes. Everything was about to change. The air felt thick with tension as David kept his hands raised, his sharp gaze locked on Officer Reynolds. The officer's fingers twitched near his belt, his breathing uneven. He was used to people obeying him, backing down, but this was different. David wasn't just another man on the street. He was someone who had faced real battles, real threats, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by a badge misused. The crowd grew, murmurs spreading like ripples in water. A woman clutched her phone, recording everything, her voice shaking as she whispered, "This isn't right." A young man in a hoodie clenched his fists at his sides, torn between stepping in and staying back. A father with his daughter on his shoulders watched warily, as if trying to decide whether this was a lesson about the world he wanted his child to see. Jamal stood frozen, still gripping the note in his hand. The words from the woman, her brother, the loss, lingered in his mind, but now they felt distant. His eyes flickered between the officer and David. He didn't know this man, didn't know what had led up to this moment, but something about the way David carried himself, strong, unshaken, reminded him of his own grandfather, a man who had taught him to always stand tall, no matter what. The woman beside him, Sarah, exhaled sharply. She had seen enough moments like this in her lifetime, seen how these stories ended. She placed a hand on her belly, instinctively protective, as if shielding her unborn child from a world she wasn't sure how to explain. "Do something," Jamal whispered, barely realizing he had spoken. Sarah hesitated, then stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Officer," she called out, her words cutting through the murmurs. "What's he being arrested for?" Reynolds shot her a sharp look. "Ma'am, stay back." "But why?" she pressed. "What did he do?" David's lips twitched in the slightest hint of something, approval, maybe. The crowd had been silent witnesses, but now, with Sarah speaking up, their courage grew. "Yeah," a voice added. "What's he done?" "Is this how we treat our veterans?" another person called out. The shift was happening, small but powerful. David could feel it, the way the air around him changed. He had seen it before, not here, not like this, but in places where the tide of a moment turned, where people made a choice to stand or stay silent. Reynolds' jaw clenched. He glanced around, realizing too late that this wasn't just about him and David anymore. It was bigger than that now. The weight of the cameras, the voices, the growing pressure, it was pressing down on him, making him second-guess his next move. And David saw it. "You don't want to do this," David repeated, his voice steady, measured. "You know you don't." For a long second, everything hung in the balance. The city noise in the background seemed to fade, the only sound the rustling of clothes, the shuffle of feet. Then, from the distance, another officer approached, moving fast. "Reynolds," the man called, a hint of urgency in his voice. "Step back." Reynolds hesitated, his pride warring with reason. His fingers twitched again, as if he was still debating, still deciding. And then, slowly, he lowered his hand. David didn't move. He didn't need to. The moment had passed, the balance shifting. The tension in the crowd didn't ease, not completely, but there was a shift, an exhale of breath as people exchanged glances. Some still held their phones up, but the moment of impact, the moment where everything could have gone in a much worse direction, had been avoided. Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Sarah, but her eyes were still locked on David, something unreadable in them. "Come on," she said quietly, nudging Jamal's arm. "We need to go." Jamal frowned but nodded, his mind still tangled in the moment. As they turned to leave, he cast one last glance at David. Their eyes met, just for a moment, and Jamal felt something pass between them, an unspoken understanding. This wasn't over. And somehow, he knew their paths would cross again. Jamal walked beside Sarah, his mind still tangled in everything that had just happened. The note in his pocket felt heavier now, like it carried more than just words. He stole a glance back at the crowd, at David standing tall, at Officer Reynolds retreating slightly, his face stiff, with barely concealed frustration. It wasn't over, not really. The tension still lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Sarah was quiet as they moved down the sidewalk, her steps slower than before. Jamal could feel the weight of something unspoken between them. He wanted to ask more about her brother, about what she had meant, but before he could, she stopped. "I shouldn't have gotten involved," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Jamal frowned. "Why not? You did the right thing." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "That's not always enough." She looked around, as if checking for something, or someone, before finally turning to face him fully. "You're a good kid," she said, her voice softer now. "And you probably don't know it yet, but small choices like the one you made today, they can change everything." Jamal swallowed. He wasn't sure what she meant exactly, but something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. He reached into his pocket, feeling the note between his fingers. "You said I reminded you of your brother." Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I did. What happened to him?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she said, "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time." Jamal waited for more, but she didn't say anything else. Before he could push further, a noise in the distance made them both turn. A voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the air. "Hey, stop." Jamal's stomach clenched. Across the street, David was moving fast, his body tense, his eyes locked onto something or someone. Officer Reynolds was following, his posture rigid, his hand hovering near his belt again. Jamal's heart pounded. The tension that had hung over the moment before had snapped back into place, tighter than before. People on the street stopped, their eyes darting between David and Reynolds. "Not again," Sarah whispered. Jamal's feet moved before he could think. He didn't know why, he wasn't even sure what was happening, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. As he pushed through the crowd, He caught sight of a figure moving near an alleyway, a shadow slipping between the buildings. It happened fast. David was turning, his expression sharp with recognition. Then suddenly, a voice rang out, one filled with anger, with fear. "You don't get to just walk away." And then everything exploded. Jamal and Sarah walked in silence, the tension from the street still clinging to them. The city felt different now, louder, heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of what had just happened. Jamal's mind was spinning, caught between the note in his pocket, the warning in Reynolds' voice, and the way David had stood so still, as if waiting for the next storm to come. Then, just as they turned onto a quieter street, Sarah's step slowed. Jamal looked up at her, confused, until he followed her gaze. Across the street, leaning against a parked car, was a man watching them. His posture was relaxed, too casual, but there was something sharp in his eyes. He was tall, dressed in plain clothes, but Jamal could tell instantly he was a cop. Sarah swallowed hard. "We should keep walking," she muttered under her breath. Jamal's stomach twisted. "Who is that?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she looped her arm through Jamal's and kept moving, her grip just a little too tight. "Just keep walking." The man didn't follow, didn't call out. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. But the way Sarah was acting told Jamal everything he needed to know. This wasn't some random cop. This was something else. They turned the next corner, and Sarah finally let out a shaky breath. "That's Detective Lawson," she said quietly. "And if he's here, it means this is bigger than we thought." Jamal frowned. "Bigger how?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. But I do know he doesn't show up unless something serious is happening." Jamal's heartbeat pounded in his ears. It wasn't just Reynolds anymore. There was something else at play, something deeper. And Sarah knew more than she was saying. They stopped at a small cafe, ducking inside to put some distance between them and the street. The hum of conversation and the scent of coffee did little to calm the tension curling in Jamal's chest. He turned to Sarah. "Tell me the truth. What's going on?" Sarah hesitated. For a long moment, she just stared at the table, as if trying to decide how much to say. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she opened a news article and slid it toward him. Jamal's eyes flickered over the words, and his stomach dropped. Veteran files lawsuit against police department, claims wrongful force used in past incident. Beneath the headline was a photo of David, standing in front of a courthouse, his expression firm. Jamal looked up, stunned. "David suing them?" Sarah nodded. "That's why Reynolds is so angry. And why Lawson is here." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "If this case goes public, it's going to bring up things the department doesn't want people to know." Jamal's mind raced. The pieces were clicking together too fast. Reynolds wasn't just another cop on a power trip. He was someone with something to lose. And if Lawson was involved, that meant the department wasn't just standing by. They were watching. Jamal exhaled slowly. "This is bad, isn't it?" Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. "It's worse than you think." Outside, across the street, Detective Lawson was still standing there. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 more officers had joined him, speaking in low voices. And even though the glass distorted their words, the way they kept looking in the direction of the cafe made one thing clear. Jamal and Sarah weren't just witnesses anymore. They were part of the story now. And someone was making sure they knew it. Jamal barely had time to react before the scene erupted into chaos. David spun around, his muscles coiled like a spring, his face set with the kind of determination that only came from years of knowing when a fight was unavoidable. Officer Reynolds was already moving in, his hand gripping his baton tightly, his face a mix of anger and something else, something closer to desperation. People on the street froze, eyes widening as they sensed the shift in the air. A few stepped back, pulling out their phones, their voices rising in confusion. Others stood rooted to the spot, watching, waiting, as if they could already feel that this was a moment that would not be forgotten. Jamal's breath hitched as he pushed forward, Sarah right behind him. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. He didn't know what he could do, but He couldn't just stand there. David lifted his hands, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. "I'm not resisting," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You need to stand down, officer." Reynolds' jaw tightened. His grip on the baton didn't loosen. His chest rose and fell with quick, sharp breaths. "You think you can just walk away after what you did?" Reynolds shot back, his voice trembling slightly, though whether it was from anger or something else, Jamal couldn't tell. David's expression didn't change. "I didn't do anything but stand my ground, just like I did for my country." The words hit like a hammer. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted uneasily. The weight of David's past, of everything he had sacrificed, was laid bare in those few words. And yet, Reynolds didn't back down. "You don't belong here," the officer muttered, barely loud enough for Jamal to hear. David's eyes darkened. His fingers twitched at his sides. The crowd was silent now, the city itself holding its breath. Then, suddenly movement in the alley caught Jamal's eye again. A shadow shifting, ducking behind a dumpster. Someone was there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Jamal's instinct screamed at him. This wasn't just about David and Reynolds anymore. There was something else at play, something bigger, something hidden in the cracks of this moment. "Jamal," Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. She had seen it too. "We need to go." Jamal hesitated, his eyes darting between David, the growing crowd, and the figure in the alley. Something told him that whatever was happening here wasn't an accident. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. Before he could move, a voice cut through the tense silence. "Back up." A second officer, one Jamal hadn't even noticed arriving, stepped in, his hand resting on his holster. The words sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. People edged away, their faces shifting from curiosity to unease. Jamal's pulse skyrocketed. This was getting out of control. David's face remained unreadable, but Jamal could see the way his shoulders tensed. He was a soldier. He knew when a situation was on the edge of spiraling. And Jamal realized with chilling certainty that David wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for what would happen next. Then, without warning, a sound, small but unmistakable, rang out from the alley. A click. Jamal turned just in time to see the shadow shift again. The glint of something metallic. "David!" he shouted. Everything happened at once. David moved. The officer spun around. The crowd gasped. Reynolds' baton swung, but it was too late. David had already sidestepped, his military training kicking in like muscle memory. The baton missed, cracking against the pavement instead. Reynolds stumbled forward. His face twisted in rage. His hand shot to his belt. And then, from the alley, the figure stepped out, a hood drawn low over their face, their hands hidden in their pockets. David saw them. So did Reynolds. And in that split second, everyone seemed to realize the same thing. This wasn't just a fight. This was something much, much bigger. Jamal felt Sarah's grip tighten on his wrist. His breath came fast and uneven. Because now it wasn't just about David. It wasn't just about Reynolds. Now, there was someone else in play. And they weren't here by accident. The alley fell silent for a moment, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on everyone. Jamal could feel his heartbeat in his ears, his body tensed as if bracing for something inevitable. The hooded figures stood still, their posture unreadable. David's stance shifted slightly, the movement so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed. But Jamal did. It was the stance of someone trained, someone ready to react. Reynolds, still seething from the near miss, barely seemed to register the new presence. His fingers twitched toward his belt again. Then, in a low, steady voice, David spoke. "You don't want to do this." For a second, Jamal thought he was talking to Reynolds. But then he realized David's eyes weren't on the officer anymore. They were locked onto the hooded figure. The air crackled with tension. The figure took a slow step forward, then another, until they were close enough for the streetlights to reveal part of their face. A woman. Young. No older than her early 20s. Her expression was tight with something Jamal couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or regret. You shouldn't be here, she said softly, her gaze flickering between David and Reynolds. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Reynolds frowned, finally shifting his attention to her. Who are you? She hesitated. Her hands twitched at her sides, like she wanted to reach for something but was forcing herself to stay still. Jamal noticed how her shoulders hunched slightly, how she kept shifting her weight from foot to foot. David took a step closer. It's okay, he said, his voice calm. Just tell us what's going on. The woman exhaled shakily, then looked past David, straight at Jamal. You don't know me, she said, but I know who you are. Jamal blinked, his stomach twisting. What? You did something today, she continued. Something small, but it mattered. More than you realize. Jamal's fingers brushed the note still in his pocket. He swallowed hard. What are you talking about? The woman hesitated, then glanced at Reynolds again before lowering her voice. You weren't supposed to see any of this. None of you were. David's jaw clenched. See what? She shook her head, frustration flashing across her face. There are people who don't want the truth coming out, she said. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep things quiet. Reynolds stiffened. What are you talking about? His voice had an edge now, but there was something else there too, something almost defensive. The woman ignored him. David's case, it's bigger than just one bad cop. It's about control. Power. And making sure people like him don't get to fight back. Jamal felt a chill go through him. David's face darkened. Who sent you? The woman shook her head. No one. Not really. I was supposed to make sure you didn't get too far. But I can't do this anymore. Jamal barely noticed the crowd pressing in around them, murmurs growing louder as people tried to piece together what was happening. He barely noticed Sarah's tight grip on his arm. All he could focus on was the weight of the moment, the way everything seemed to be unraveling at once. Then, from somewhere nearby, the distant sound of sirens broke the air. The woman's eyes widened slightly. I have to go. David tensed. Wait. But before he could move, the woman turned and disappeared back into the alley, vanishing into the darkness, like she had never been there at all. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. His anger seemed to have drained out of him, replaced with something else, exhaustion, maybe. Or something close to it. David took a step back, shaking his head. This isn't over. Reynolds met his gaze, but this time, he didn't say anything. He didn't argue. The sirens grew closer. People started shifting, murmuring. Some backed away, others lingered, watching. Sarah let out a slow breath. We should go. Jamal hesitated, looking up at David. He didn't want to just leave, not after everything, but he could tell David knew that too. And for the first time, David didn't look like a man standing alone. He looked like a man who had been seen. Jamal nodded. Without another word, he and Sarah turned, slipping back into the city, letting the night swallow them. As they walked, Jamal reached into his pocket, pulling out the note again. He unfolded it slowly, reading the words one more time. Small things change the world. His fingers tightened around the paper. Maybe today wasn't just about David. Maybe it wasn't just about Reynolds. Maybe it was about all the moments in between, the ones that seemed small but weren't. The choices people made when they thought no one was watching. Jamal glanced at Sarah, then back at the street behind them. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning.